evaluate the following, and then we have 4 different square roots to evaluate, each of which has a negative number on the inside. Let's look at these one at a time. We'll start with the square root of negative 100. Now, we know that negative 100 can be written as 100 times negative 1. So we can split this radical up into the product root 100 times root negative 1. Now, the square root of 100 is 10, so we can evaluate that like that. And remember that the square root of negative 1 is I, the imaginary number. So by breaking this up into 100 and negative 1 and evaluating each of these square roots, we end up with 10i. Whenever we're taking the square root of a negative number, we can either decide to factor out the negative 1, which then becomes an I, or we can just recognize that that negative inside is going to become an I on the outside. For the next one, we have the square root of negative 144. Again, we can split this up into the square root of 144 times the square root of negative 1. But let's do a shortcut here. We know that this negative is going to end up being a negative 1, and when we take the square root of that, we get an I. So let's just put that I on the outside, and then we can evaluate the square root of 144. That's 12, because 12 times 12 is 144, and we end up with 12i as our answer. We could have gone through the process of pulling out the negative 1, but it's easier if we can just recognize that the square root of a negative is going to end up being an imaginary number. Let's do the next one, the square root of negative 1/4. We know that because we're taking the square root of a negative, that's going to become an I, and we'll have an imaginary number. Now we just need to take the square root of 1/4. What can you multiply by itself to get 1/4? And the answer is 1/2. 1/2 times 1/2 is 1/4, so we end up with 1/2 I. Another way of taking the square root of a fraction is to take the square root of the numerator and denominator separately. The square root of 1 is 1, the square root of 4 is 2, and so we end up with 1/2, and of course, the I. Our last one is the square root of negative 13. Now we know that we're going to end up with an I here, because we're taking the square root of a negative number, but this one is a little bit different. 13 isn't a perfect square, so we can't easily take the square root. In a situation like this, we just leave the 13 under the radical, and so we end up with the square root of 13i. If you were asked for an approximation, you could use a calculator to figure out what the square root of 13 is approximately equal to. It's going to be 3 point something. But generally, unless you're asked for an approximation, we prefer to keep answers in their exact form. And by leaving this as root 13i, we're not going to be doing any approximating. We get an exact answer. And so there we go. In general, these negative signs under the radicals just become i's when we pull them out. That's the takeaway.